Welcome to the questions and answers part concerning session 11 on global environmental change. First, once again, I have to admit that I made a mistake. There was a knot on slide 16 that should not have been there. So the idea was not that in a degrowth world we would not have less high tech, but rather that in a degrowth world we would have less high tech. This was a problem that emerged because I changed the sentence a bit and then there was not too much left. So I changed the slide and also exchanged it in Ilias. So if you already have downloaded it and want to learn for the exam with it, either be aware of the mistake that I made there or download the corrected version. Okay, now I come to your questions. And I must once again said I really enjoyed your question. I really enjoyed how passionate you were about the topic. And once again, I'm kind of bummed that I cannot discuss more of your questions. And I would also, I think, enjoy actually discussing them with you in a more actual sense than just recording this response video. However, this is what we get this year. So I chose 8 questions, each of them covering one part of the lecture, one aspect that many of you addressed, and I always selected one of those questions addressing that aspect. So the first concerns the question, what are systemic threats and what are not systemic threats? Because you remember at the beginning of the lecture I made the case that there are a lot of environmental problems that have something to do with economic growth and with capitalism. However, I argued, and I still believe, that most of these problems can be overcome within capitalism just like that and will probably not cause a systemic threat. So the question addresses exactly this. I disagree with you when you said that depletion, scarcity of resources is probably no problem for sustained economic growth in modernity. To me, it seems like production is shifting from handcrafts to a quickly growing production of modern technologies for electric cars, cameras, smartphones, computers, smart home devices, and the required service of the electrified and digitalized world. Those are reliant on rare earth, which first do not grow again that quickly, and second, that extraction lets out toxic trash which can easily destroy the environment. And also pollution of our seas and groundwater is a real danger for our food production, and we therefore workers would not exist without food. And I think those are both valid arguments. So the arguments that there might be a problem with resource depletion and there might be a problem with pollution. And with resource depletion, there's even, I would argue, a bigger problem than rare earth. And this is simply sand, because I don't know if you know that, there is actually a shortage in plain sand, not because it's used for computer chips, but because it's used for creating concrete from which most bigger buildings are built these days. And this is actually a resource that has become rare over the last couple of years, because you cannot use the sand from the desert because it's the grains are too fine, so you have to use sand from the seas, and this is increasingly a rare resource ever since the big building boom in China commenced. So these are real problems. Here, however, is the difference between these kinds of problems and global warming that I see, and that I still believe is a valid distinction. What I think capitalism is very good in is creating innovative solutions to problems that are current and pressing and urgent and right there, and that create costs that apply right now. So whenever something becomes costly in capitalism to people who have money, then some smart entrepreneurs will probably think of a way to address this problem. Some engineers, some universities, someone will probably have an idea to either build smartphones or computers with different elements, or to create better ways to recycle them from old devices, and so on and so on. I'm quite confident that this will work, and if it doesn't work quick enough, then these certain products will simply become more expensive, and people will have to spend their money on something else if they cannot afford these products. And that's why I don't see this as systemic threat. And something similar probably goes for the pollution of air and groundwater and land and so on. These are all problems, and particularly if you are in a poor community, many people probably there will die from it. I don't want to say it's harmless, I don't want to say it's no problem. I just want to say capitalism won't. So when it happens in rich areas, capitalism will address the problem. When it happens in poor areas, capitalism will not care that much. And either way, our general way of life, which has been built on massive inequalities for years and decades and centuries, will probably be able to go on, and you can still address these inequalities within this basic way of life. And I'm not saying this is good, I'm not saying that you're not right if you want to change the entire way of life because of the inequalities and the things that are bad about it. You can make a valid case about this. However, I'm confident that capitalism can survive this. What's different with global warming is that the big challenges come 20, 30, 40, 50, 60 years after the problems are caused, because there is such a long delay between the emission of ever more carbon dioxide into the atmosphere and the point where there are not just like a couple of more droughts or storms here and there, but a point where our whole natural environment will change fundamentally. So, and this happens a long time after the problem is caused. And so at the moment when the problem is caused, capitalism doesn't really have an incentive to address the problem. And at the time when the problem becomes really urgent and really big, then it will be too late to address the problem. And this is what I find is the big difference that I see. And you must or you don't have to be convinced by this, but that's what's the idea that I had there. But once again, I'm not saying that pollution and resource scarcity are not problems that one should discuss, but I wanted to limit the lecture to one topic, so I chose global warming. Second problem addresses this distinction between either approaching the problem as a problem of ethical consumption or as a problem of political activism. And many of you took issue with what I said there, and I just read the question, which I think is representative of questions or comments that many of you left, and then I try to explain myself once again. So here it goes. You said that if I buy more expensive meat, I though cannot control the circumstances in which workers work and animals are grown. This is for sure true for most of the meat in the supermarket, but doesn't that situation turn by e.g. buying in farmers market or at least regional products where I know where the animal lived? Second, just a thought, maybe living carbon free doesn't change anything in the scales, etc. But if a lot of people would try, there would be a changed mindset and more acceptance to the idea of handling it collectively, means politically. And I agree with both of these points. So why did I why did I include this polemical note against this idea that we should focus on consumption into the lecture? I did this first because I often have the impression that many students have a strong focus on what we as consumers can do and almost forget the politics of it. And maybe it's not true with you, but heard this kind of talk while teaching quite often. And so I found it very important to emphasize the relevance of politics there. This is the first point. Second point is, if you look what was written on the slide, then you will see that I did not argue against the idea that ethical decisions in consumption are relevant. I only argued against the idea that as consumers we have it in our hand. Because I believe that consumers have something in their hand and they can make a change, but this can only go so far. So just think of the difference between ethics and politics or the law. So ethics is something that we can collectively engage in discussions about. So what is a good way of leading our lives? What is the good life? So we discuss about this publicly and collectively, but in the end, every single person has to make these decisions for themselves every day, every hour, over and over again. So if I think about ethical consumption, it means that every person that ever goes shopping has every time they go shopping to decide, well, do I buy this product or do I buy that product? So whenever you have to buy new pants because the pandemic is over and we finally have to wear pants again, then you have to decide for every pants you buy, well, do I buy the one that was fairly produced? Do I buy the one that was sustainably produced? Do I buy the one that I like because it looks good? Do I buy the one that is the cheapest because I have limited funds? So you have to make these decisions every day and every day and every day, and everyone has to do them. And if that's the condition, then it's very likely that many people will argue, well, in general I'm for ethical consumption, but these pants, they look so great and I really want them and I also need them, and they are only 30 euros, so I would be stupid not to buy them. The next time I'll certainly buy the ethical pants. And you can see this quite often. I'm not saying this always happens, but it is bound to happen quite often. So ethics is very exhausting and it's very demanding. In politics, however, it's just that the state has to decide once, these are the rules, these products are allowed to be sold, these products are not allowed to be sold, and then the individuals don't have to think about this every day anymore. And this is particularly true when you talk about the conditions in the meat packing industry, because the state could simply render it illegal to have workers working under certain conditions, under certain contracts, and renting certain forms of housing to them. The state could just define the conditions by which this happens, and then the consumers wouldn't have to think about this as consumers. They only think about this as citizens and then vote for parties that have a certain line there. And then this is a question that addresses them as citizens, and then as consumers they can just buy the stuff that they want. And I think this is a much more promising approach. However, I absolutely agree with your second point, namely that we shouldn't pit ethics and consumption and politics against one another. And maybe I did a little bit too much of that in the lecture, because as you said, I would argue that if we have this ethical debate about what kind of food or clothes we want and we need and what kind of behaviors we want, this already leads this does not block political action, but it can also help having political action. And it's far easier to convince everyone that, I don't know, we should not eat meat if you don't eat meat. So you probably have a hard time convincing others that there should be law prohibiting beef if you're having a steak between your teeth. That's not a very compelling argument then. If you yourself and all of your friends eat vegetarian for years, then you might already have a little bit of a better chance with legal action there. So you shouldn't pit the two against one another, but what I really want to emphasize that politics is important and ethics alone will not do the trick, particularly not in global warming. The next point addresses global climate justice. question goes like this. I was wondering, how could we both have a high quality of life without polluting the planet? You said that all the countries of the world must participate together in the fight against climate change. I do not think so. Also, I understand your argument well, but in my opinion, it is not the business of African countries where the population is not even able to have an average standard of living. In my opinion, trying to replace fossil energy with any other alternative is so expensive that will cause even more poverty. And here I kind of agree with you. I would also say that addressing global warming is not something where African countries in general, so African countries are very, very different, but in general that they have the strongest duty to do it, because the ones that have been polluting or have been emitting carbon dioxide for the last 200 years were mainly European countries, North American countries, and more recently also Eastern Asian countries, so Japan already longer, but China really has become a big polluter in the last couple of decades when economic development took hold there. However, what I would also say, it would be catastrophic if half of Africa engaged in the same kind of growth based on burning coal that China did over the last couple of decades. This should not happen. I'm not saying that African countries are at the forefront here, but there are certain things that should better not happen. However, in a way, it's not as bad as you say that, because you're right that typically renewable energies are more expensive than fossil fuels. However, in some countries the conditions might even be better for solar power, and many African countries, when we come to the GDP development, they are decades and centuries behind many European countries. However, they don't have to engage in coal-based growth anymore, because right now, particularly in countries that have a lot of sunlight, they can just let out this stage of burning coal and just jump to renewable energies. And if you look at the data of which countries have a lot of their energy they use as renewable energy, you actually find quite a few African countries at the top of the list there. Of course, this also has something to do with the fact that they have so they produce and consume less energy per capita per day than most European countries, but they are not, so they already kind of solved the problems. So that's also a thing. But in general, I would say that of course the European countries and North American countries that are responsible for much of the global warming that we've seen so far, and also for much of the carbon dioxide that's in the atmosphere already, they have the responsibility to in this case really help the African countries becoming carbon neutral, or even having a negative carbon balance. So that's something that I would say is the responsibility of the richer countries, because they are richer and they can actually help there. But yeah, okay, so much. Okay, next question on degrowth. I do not quite understand path B, degrowth. How can it be possible to maintain living conditions for about 8 billion people and at the same time slow down growth? You also mentioned some examples of instances of degrowth, such as the financial crisis in 2008, but these instances had horrendous effects, just like the pandemic now, on the living conditions of many people all over the world. How would such a system of degrowth even look like? So first, two introductory points. First, degrowth is not one coherent problem. Rather, degrowth is kind of an umbrella term for different approaches that want quite different things. So it's hard to pinpoint it as just like one thing. Secondly, I think I said this in lecture, at least I wanted to say it, that no theorist of degrowth says, well, let's look at the Great Depression, that was the model of how we should live. this was only part of my argument that actually a shrinking economy means a shrinking carbon emission. So what degrowth certainly means, if you take it seriously, is that we can't live in capitalism anymore, and it means that we don't produce ever more. But part of the answer is already in the question. You say that how can we have living conditions for 8 billion people if we slow down growth? Well, if you just think about what you and I spend our money on, a small share of what we consume and spend our money on is actually required for our living conditions. So you can simply argue, well, who actually needs a car, particularly if they work less and have more time? Who actually needs a smartphone? Who actually needs a notebook computer? Who actually needs this and that and that and that and that? And how many sets of clothes do we actually need? And so people had means to survive 50 and 100 years ago, when the GDP per capita in the richer nations was a fraction of what it is now. And you can easily just ask, well, did all this GDP growth that the Western countries, for example, witnessed over the last 80 years, did this really make everybody happy? And up till what degree did it actually make people happy? And from what degree does it just like means more growth just for its own sake? So is there really this rationality behind it, that more GDP actually means more happiness and more health out there? Or can you just find other ways? So you can easily make this argument with smartphones. So don't get me wrong, I'm certainly not in a position to scold anyone for using their smartphones too often. I'm the worst with that. But another person than me could argue, well, does it really make you happy, or does it not make your life more stressful because you're available 24 hours a day, you are connected to the whole world 24 hours a day, and you're always subject to judgments of others when you post stuff online all over the day? And I think those are valid ethical points, asking what a good life is, and if all this economic growth actually contributes to a good life. And so I would say, as a critique of growth as an end in itself, I would say degrowth theory or degrowth theories have many valid points. I'm just not really convinced that degrowth leads us to a practice in which we can stop global warming and still have supplies for 8 billion people. Next point, green growth. Some experts claim that green growth is a contradiction in terms. Perhaps you could comment on this, as I do not fully understand this statement. So maybe I try to answer this in 3 or 4 steps. So first steps is, as I showed in the lecture, historically there is a very strong correlation between a growing GDP and a growth in carbon emission and a growth in using of natural resources as well. Last part I didn't show in the lecture, but it's also true. So the higher the GDP, the higher the use of all kinds of metals, of sands, of all kinds of things happens to be. So these things are correlated. This is an historical fact. Second step, there is, when you think in terms of economic theory, there is no necessary reason for this connection. Remember what I said in the lecture about the spending $100 on either a plane ticket or an electronic device or a massage or a tree? This means there is no necessary connection between the GDP growth measured in dollars and the growth in the use of resources or emission of carbon dioxide. The two are not necessarily coupled. So in economic theory, we could also envision some form of capitalism where we don't use any kind of natural resources that cannot be regrown. Of course, if you define tomatoes that you grow in a field as a natural resource, then we will always need natural resources, because without them we cannot eat. But you could easily think of a form of capitalism or another kind of growth-based economy where you just use things that you can always recreate and regrow so that they are renewable. So you only need renewable resources. You can construct these kinds of systems, and then you can also construct the systems in a way that a lot of their growth is based on services, not on goods. And this makes this decoupling of emitting carbon dioxide and needing resources from GDP growth even stronger. However, in the third step, you can argue, well, that's just in theory the case. If we look at it in praxis, we have seen this kind of claim that we can have green growth and that we can decouple economic growth from the use of resources and carbon emissions. We have seen this claim for decades, or we've heard this claim for decades. If we look at the things that actually happen over the last 20, 30, 40 years, maybe we see that there is a certain increase in efficiency, so that we now don't get $1 out of a kilogram of carbon dioxide, but $2 out of a kilogram of carbon dioxide or so. However, there is no total uncoupling, but only a slight increase in efficiency, and that's never gonna move us beyond global warming. So these are just the facts, and anything you say about green growth, that is just pie in the sky kind of liberal theoretic bullshit. Then you can also take a fourth step, and this was a bit what the argument that I made in lecture is saying, well, yes, historically you're right, this decoupling never fully worked, but maybe we haven't tried hard enough. Maybe this wasn't the actual thing that we tried, and maybe we just have to have stronger social movements demanding this. Maybe we have to have more decisive governments trying this. Maybe we actually need something like this Green New Deal in the United States and a Green Deal in the European Union, just a little bit more stronger. And you know, the Green Deal of the European Union is that the goal of it is that by 2050 the European Union should be carbon neutral. And that, of course, is a big goal when you look where we are right now, and it's probably not even enough for the 1.5 degree target. However, it is something, and it is not totally implausible that this works. And if you want to decide between argument number 3 and argument number 4, of course, then you have to ask the question, so why didn't we succeed with the decoupling of economic growth from the growth of emission and the growth of using resources over the last 20, 30, 40 years? And then you probably arrive at exactly the 2 points that I had on the very bottom of the slide on green growth. Namely, we have this problem with the practice of consumerism and this economic dynamics that come from consumerism, that most people kind of know that global warming is a thing, but they still want a new car. And then maybe 5 years later they think, well, I need another new car because it will burn, a little bit less fuel per 100 kilometers. And then they buy another car. And however, buying this car will cause more damage to the environment than just running the old car a little bit longer. And these kinds of dynamics of consumerism, they might be why so far we didn't have the green growth. Secondly, there are the political dynamics. So we always had the fossil fuel industry lobby that always tried to water down all kinds of legislation that actually could have led to such an uncoupling. And this also is a thing. And both of these things, so the economics of consumerism and the lobbying of the vested interests against this, and this is not only industries but also sometimes the unions from these industries. So if you look at the coal compromise in Germany, it was actually that the union of the workers in this sector were also pressured for maintaining coal energy a little bit longer. These are the main point. Then you have to think, if you want to decide whether green growth is just theoretical pie in the sky bullcrap, or whether it's a real thing that we just haven't tried hard enough, then you have to think, well, can we actually overcome these two obstacles, or can we not overcome them? And I think this is an open question. I'm not 100% decided on it, but maybe that's where I leave it here. And maybe you should decide it. Next question, once again, so what you see on the slide here is not actually a question that you posed, but just some more points that I wanted to add. So in general, my whole lecture was based on the question whether we want degrowth or green growth, and some of you asked questions concerning this. And if you think about what we need, just what is the better path, just think about what we need for either of those two courses. So what we would need for degrowth is we would have to come up with an economic system that will be sort of carbon neutral, not be based on capitalist growth, and still be able to supply 8 billion people with the necessities. That's something we have to think of, how we can structure this. And we don't have only have to think of it in university seminars, we also have to realize this in social reality. And this can probably only work if there is a social and political evolution, because the social and political and economic systems that we have right now are not this system. So we have to change the entire system there, which means probably we have to have some kind of global socialist revolution. And on top of all of that, and having global socialist revolution is not easy. Many people have tried and it didn't quite work out, to say the very least. And so finally, and on top of all that, is the fact that when you try to convince your fellow human beings that they should engage in this global socialist revolution with you, you cannot even say to them, well, let's do a revolution. After that, we will all be more wealthy and we'll all have a better life with more stuff. No, you have to convince them that, well, let's do a revolution. After the revolution, we will have less stuff that we can use. And still, we will have a better life. So let's go. And I don't know if you ever try to organize a socialist revolution. It's hard enough if you promise people that they will have more afterwards. It's probably even harder if you promise them that we'll have less afterwards, even if you have good reasons for it. So I'm not saying it's not a good idea or that's impossible, but I'm not really convinced that this is going to work out, because remember, we have 20 or 30 years until the economic transformation has to be finished and we have to be carbon neutral. And just like organizing a socialist revolution and then restructuring the whole economy and then being finished with that in 20, 30 years, that's a big task, so you better start. What you need to do in the next 20 or 30 years for green growth is comparatively simple, I think. You have to make sure that there is a massive investment in renewable energies, and I mean massive not in the scale of millions or billions, but certainly in the scale of trillions. And we also need massive investments in curbing emissions. So both go together, of course, but we have to invest in both. And this also means you have to break the power of the lobbying power of the fossil fuels industry, and you have to change the logic of consumerism. And these are also really, really big tasks. However, I would say they're slightly more possible if I evaluate the two against one another. Also, I'm not really convinced that this is going to happen either, but I think it's more possible, and this is particularly so if you add to this equation the fact that in the first scenario, we really need to convince billions of people to go along with you. In the second scenario, you only need to convince a couple of governments to go along with you. And in general, people are easier to convince than governments, but a couple are easier to convince than a few billion. So I guess the better investment of your political energy would be the latter, but that's your decision. Next topic is the reality of the global governments on climate change. And so two of you asked, or some of you asked questions on the Paris Agreement. I picked these two questions out of them. First question is, didn't the Paris Agreement focus on the 1.5 and 2 degree standard? Shouldn't the line for the pledges then more or less match with the 1.5 or 2 degree line? Or is the difference the US withdrawing from the equation, from the agreement? I would say, so yes. This is what the Paris Accord was mostly about the 1.5 degree target, and so you would expect that they agree on targets that help meeting that target. However, it's like a multi-step program, so the governments all agreed where you want to get. So you want to get to 1.5 degree of global warming at the end of the century or so. And that's the first step. The second step is all countries decide how much they will contribute to it. So how much will they reduce their own emissions? And if you look at and if you compare those two values, then you already see that if you add up all the pledges that the individual governments made with the target, and you also take into consideration what the climate scientist says would be possible, would be necessary, then there's already a mismatch. So even if all the governments did achieve what they pledged, it would probably not end up with 1.5 degrees. And if you then take in the third step into consideration the actual policies that these countries engaged in for meeting their targets that they themselves define of how much they will curb their emissions, that doesn't even match either. So there's a double mismatch there. And this is kind of like you saying, well, I want to have a straight A average at the end of my studies and just define this as your goal. But then you define your goal, well, to reach this, I will go to class maybe once a week or so and read my textbook every other week. And then you only go to class every other week and read the textbook once a month. And so probably this does not work, but you have this very ambitious goal that you strive at, and the means you deploy to reach this goal don't quite add up. And that so far is the grim reality of global climate governments. And it's like this, and just like the United States withdrawing from the agreement came on top of all of that. And the United States, of course, is one of the biggest polluters out there, or one of the biggest, yes. So this was the first question. Second question is, I assume that the framework of the Paris Climate Agreement is mainly based upon the path of green growth. Does it favor one of the sub-approaches you discussed, or is it kept rather vague in this regard? The latter is true. So the Paris Agreement worked in the way that I just described. So the agreement defined the goal that you want to reach, and then all countries had to pledge what their individual contribution would be, and the goal was defined in terms of degrees of global warming. The pledge was defined in terms of tons of carbon dioxide emission, or curbing the carbon dioxide emission. And these were the things that were agreed upon there. And whether a country reaches these goals they defined with a more market liberal approach, saying, okay, we price our carbon, or whether they do it another way, that's more or less up to the countries to decide. Which is probably, as it comes to global governance, a smart way to approach this. Maybe just adding one more point here. Some of you also are asked what I think about the method of carbon pricing. I would say it's not my favorite version, so I'm more of a green Keynesian public investment kind of guy. However, I think carbon pricing can do the trick with two caveats here. So the first caveat is that the prices will have to be high enough, and they have to be higher than what is talked about right now. This is the first thing, and there shouldn't be any loopholes. So it has to be really sufficiently effective, and this is something where lobbying has always been watering it down. So in theory, I would say it's a possibility, but the practice has to be strong enough there. And secondly, with carbon pricing, there's always the problem of social justice. So if you say, well, we just put a higher price tag on carbon emissions, that's a reasonable approach in general. However, if we have people in the population that struggle at paying their bills anyway, and not because they waste so much energy, but because they don't have that much money, then this might become unfair. So you have also to redistribute financial resources to these poorer households at the same time to make sure that they can still afford to turn on the light when it's dark and to heat their apartment when it's cold, because this is not where the waste is happening, is not with the poor. Because if you look just at the statistics, the most ecologically conscious rich person will always have a larger carbon footprint than the most wasteful poor person. So if you do carbon pricing, make it strong enough and effective, and don't punish the poor. Okay, final slide here is concerning the question of pessimism and optimism. Interestingly, some of you thought that I was optimistic, some of you thought that I was pessimistic. I'm not so sure what I am, and here's what you said. That you also probably think that there will be a combination of path 1 and path 3, so meaning we try some degree of green growth, but in the end there will also be a lot of business as usual. And this combination, of course, then means that we probably fail to meet the 1.5 degree target. We certainly fail to miss that. We also very, very likely fail to meet the 2 degree target. And probably if we have this kind of business as usual with a green touch on it approach, maybe we end up with a 3 degree target or something like that. And this is, if the general calculations are correct, then this will be catastrophic. And so this is rather pessimistic. And this, of course, then means that probably right now is not only the time to invest in renewable energies and invest in curbing carbon emissions in order to reduce global warming as far as we can. Probably it would also be smart to start thinking about investing in ways to deal with the damage that will happen. And so just know that sea levels will be rising, know that there will be droughts, know that there will be natural disasters, and also kind of prepare for this. And this, of course, cannot replace trying to reduce emissions, but it probably also has to happen. If it cannot be prevented, we also have to think about how to deal with the consequences. And this is then once again where the questions of global justice become really, really pressing, because to be honest, I mean, for most of history, the richer countries got better through everything, and people in the richer countries got better through everything. And this possibly means that there will be, so if we have not the worst case scenario, but also not the best case scenario, it probably means that millions will die at some point, and probably most of them will not be from the richest countries, and not millions, but many millions. and that's something that you have to analyze then. So will the measures that the richer countries take, will they aim at saving human lives, or will they aim at defending the privilege of the inhabitants of the richer countries against the demands of the poorer countries? And okay, I'm not optimistic. And if history tells us anything, it's probably that the focus will be on preserving the privileges and defending them against those in the poorer countries. Okay, this was not a positive note to end the questions and answer part with, but that's it. See you.